Good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome to Friday's Tech Talk. And while we wait for the attendees to chime in, I'd like to introduce you the Tech Academy. So, can everyone see my screen? Hopefully, we can. All right. So, um, the Tech Academy has been around for over 10 years now and offering beginner friendly, flexible, and affordable online coding boot camps. So, as most of you know, coding boot camps is a short, intensive program designed to train you for entry level tech jobs in just few months and no experience needed. And our mission is simple is to get you working in tech. And then we are offering 12 boot camps from AI and cybersecurity to web and mobile app development. Our programs are self paced, supported by instructors, flexible, and you can start anytime and learn on your own schedule. They are beginner friendly and thorough, priced under national average, and again, no tech background is needed to start. And then we are also proud to have an average rating of 4.8 stars from students and grads across all major bootcamp review sites. So as you can see, we have what do you call this? Awards from SwitchUp, Newsweek. I think this one is Course Report, Career Karma. I'm not sure what the other one, but as you can see here are our awards. And then some of here are we are also we are 4.8 with reviews. So yeah. And then um to learn more ahead, go check the learncodinganywhere.com/contact and you can use these credentials right here flashed on your screen and you can fill out a short form and to unlock helpful videos and next steps. So we'll give you a minute or two while we wait for more attendees to chime in. So before we also head out to our tech talk for Friday. All right. So I just wanted to check in as well. Where are we guys located at? Just to break the ice. You can drop um your cities here in our chat. Ooh, good. That's good. We are everywhere, I guess. All right. Um, let's move on now. Ooh, hi Robert, you're here. It's good to see you here. So, Brittany Robert is one of our students, graduates here in the Tech Academy. So, for next one, just a quick heads up: if you prefer someone who enrolls and successfully complete the enrollment process, we do offer 5% commissions on the referrals. So many of our enrollments comes from happy student that are referred to us. So yeah, I guess that's my presentation. I'll let Brittany share her screen for now. All right, so it's already 1:05, and now let's get started with today's Tech Talk. We're excited to welcome Brittany Ellich, senior software engineer at GitHub. She's a career switcher, full stack engineer, speaker, writer, and podcast host. Today, she'll show us why web accessibility is essential, not optional, and how AI is helping create more inclusive digital spaces. So, without further ado, Brittany, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Looks like everybody can see my screen. So let's get into this. Welcome. As Gracie mentioned, my name is Brittany. I am a senior software engineer at GitHub. I'm currently working on one of the billing teams. I've also worked on GitHub Actions. I am also interested in speaking and educating in basic developer advocacy. I have a newsletter called the Balanced Engineer newsletter and a podcast called Overcommitted with a few of my other software engineer buddies, as well as a blog at brittanyellick.com. I'm also an amateur meme creator. I make a lot of memes on the internet, and some of them are decent. As a little disclaimer, I'm not an expert in accessibility by any means. These are all my own thoughts and opinions and just things that I've learned over time. GitHub does care a lot about accessibility, and we have a whole accessibility resource that I'll link at the end. But these are my own thoughts and not necessarily my employer's. So here's what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to go over understanding what web accessibility is. We're also going to go over some common barriers and how different users might experience the web. And then, because I hate when I go to a talk and it's all theory and no action, I'm also going to show you some examples about how to actually build accessibility in real life. So we'll do a little bit on techniques for improving accessibility, some accessibility testing, and if we hopefully have time for it, a demo at the end. So my two objectives here: when you're a software engineer, you have a lot of ilities or itty things at the end with like readability and scalability and maintainability and availability and blah, 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 blah. Software engineering is just a field of trade-offs, and you're constantly having to consider them and trade off between them. And accessibility should be one of them. So my goal here is to convince you that accessibility should be one of your key skill set investments when you're getting into the world of software engineering, and also give you the tools to start making the web a more accessible place. So let's get into what accessibility is. There's a lot of different definitions out there, and depending on who you talk to, they're all going to have a different one. So let's go through a few of them that I really like. First, what is accessibility? So here's the inclusive practice of ensuring there are no barriers. Did not type that correctly. There's a little typo. That prevent interaction with or access to websites online by people with physical disabilities, situational disabilities, and socioeconomic restrictions on bandwidth and speed. So a lot of folks, when they think about web accessibility, think about the physical disabilities that come to mind first, things like, visual disabilities or low vision. But there's a lot of other things that to consider when you're thinking about users using your website. For example, a situational disability. One might be if you are driving a car, so you can't read at the same time. So it's useful to have anything that has to be read also spoken. Or if you're holding a baby and you only have one hand to use your phone, it can make it more difficult to do certain gestures on your phone. Restrictions on bandwidth and speed. This is also very, very important to think about as we create more and more applications that reach a global audience, making sure that what you're building is not difficult to get on devices that might not have the best bandwidth. This is very important when it comes to things like JavaScript bundles that can get very large and very difficult to download on the internet. It's another list of examples that I really like from Ann Gibson. She wrote this blog post a while back, An Alphabet of Accessibility Issues, and just describing all the different ways and all of the different things to think about that most folks don't necessarily think about when they think about web accessibility. So things like, yes, somebody might be blind and using the web. There also might be somebody who broke some fingers, or somebody who is going through a medical event and needs chemo and has different abilities depending on what's on that's going on, or somebody who's colorblind, et cetera, et cetera. This is a really, really great resource to read through and just think about the vast different array of accessibility issues to consider. There's also this one that I see quite a lot, A11Y, if you're curious. The 11 stands for the 11 letters in between the A and the Y. It's always pronounced A11Y instead of ally, even though it looks like the word ally, because ally means something different. Another one that I really like, the absence of barriers to information. Plain and simple, making sure that there aren't any barriers to the information that folks need to get on the internet. And this is another one that I really like, and this is the last one, I promise. Accessibility is good design. Making a website more accessible typically makes it more usable for every user, not necessarily just folks with disabilities. Some users come to prefer different accessibility features. For example, I don't necessarily need reduced motion features specifically because I have a disability of any kind, but I do get pretty distracted when I see GIFs going. So I love the reduced motion feature and usually turn it on most devices that I'm on. Another one, some accessibility features end up becoming widely used. For example, the blurring of your background on a Zoom or Google Meet call, I guess is what we're on. That ability originally started out as an accessibility thing so that it would help folks focus on the person instead of what was going on in the background. Some of those end up becoming widely used by everybody. So they usually end up improving accessibility for everyone. Now, why is this important to learn about? A lot of different reasons. It makes your website available to everyone, for one thing, which is, in and of itself, I think is a really good goal. It also expands your app's potential audience. We'll talk a little bit about what the overall impact is of inaccessible websites on users, but it's pretty vast. So making sure that, you're reaching the entire audience that you can get to is important. It's also more important, specifically for this audience, to be more competitive in the job market. This is a thing that a lot of companies do poorly. And so if you have accessibility skills, it can really help set you apart when you are looking for a job. Legal, there's probably some sort of legal obligation that your company may or may not have to worry about. I'm not a lawyer, so I just assume we should probably do the most accessible thing and go with that. There's also moral and ethical reasons to do it. I think that as software engineers, we are typically stewards of access to information on the internet. And so it's something that we need to do correctly to make sure that everyone can access that information. That access to information is a basic human right to not be discriminated against or access information and participate equally in society. Almost everything is on the internet now. So if you are somebody who is controlling access to information on the internet, you should make sure that everybody can get to it. I think that this is also very relevant to both front-end and back-end engineers. I think a lot of back-end engineers typically try to tune out a little bit when they start hearing accessibility, but you're probably still your website's biggest user. So you still have influence over what your website is doing. So it's still a great thing to learn about, even if you are not necessarily going to be doing it day to day. The overall impact, 1.3 billion people globally have disabilities. That's 15 to 25% of all humans have a disability of some sort. And most Americans with disabilities are still using the internet every single day. And 96% of the top 1 million web pages had accessibility issues in 2023. 96%, almost ubiquitously, websites have accessibility issues. This is something that we're really, really bad at as an industry and something that we can do much better at. And we're starting to see a lot more court cases related to web accessibility as well. So it's important to start learning about. 1 out of 4 people have a disability, but 4 out of 4 people have a need to access that information. If you're just considering things like ROI from increasing the number of users on your website, I don't think you're necessarily thinking about it the correct way, because accessibility improves the access for all users, making it more readable and easier to find the information in multiple different ways. It's going to benefit everybody, not just folks that have a disability. So let's talk a little bit about how to do it. There are some key principles from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The current version is 2.2. These are all the recommendations and, in some cases, the legal requirements for making web content more accessible. They're divided into 4 different categories. So that's perceivable, making content accessible to all different senses. Operable, making sure that things are navigable and usable by all users. Understandable, using things like a clear design and having content that is easy to understand. And robust, things related to be interpreted by a wide variety of user agents, for example, from a mobile device or from a tablet or from a computer, things of that nature. Here's the other thing to understand is that accessibility standards are ever evolving. Yes, we have the WCAG 2.2 right now, but there's going to be new things in 2.3 and 3.0 and beyond. Nobody really has this all figured out. And just because you get accessible, that doesn't necessarily mean that your website will be accessible forever, because we're going to constantly learn new ways that folks need assistance accessing the internet. So it's an important skill to employ and learn how to use. Increasingly as well in the world of generative AI, as we are doing more reviewing of code and less writing of code, we need to understand this to make sure that we're not introducing inaccessible code into our code environment, because not all generative AI is necessarily good at writing accessible code. You need people there to verify that it is accessible. With that, common barriers and how users might experience the web. We'll go through a few different examples and different ways that folks experience the web. So one example that I think is the first thing that most folks think about when they think about accessing the web with a disability is low vision and screen readers, which is true. That is a very common way that folks will use the web if they have vision impairment. There's also some other things to think about. There's something called a Braille reader, where you can actually print out a website in Braille for somebody with vision issues to use. There's also other types of low vision other than blindness, things like color blindness or just getting older and having trouble reading small text. So things like high contrast mode and considering what your website looks like when you're zoomed in or when your screen is magnified is really important. A lot of responsive sites don't necessarily respond well to zooming. There's also different motor and mobility impairments. So things like some folks might only be able to use a keyboard to navigate your website. Some might only be able to use a mouse. There's also different switches or mouth sticks depending on what folks' capabilities are. There's eye tracking software and voice dictation software that can all have different impacts on how somebody is accessing your website. So making sure that there are multiple ways to get to everything on the website is very important. There's also some cognitive and neurological disabilities that might result in folks wanting something like a predictable page structure and design. You decide to put your nav bar at the very bottom of the screen. That might be a really neat design choice, but maybe not the most accessible design choice, because most folks are going to expect it to be at the top. Making sure that your website is consistent, not only with different standards on how folks make websites, but with the way that the website is read throughout the website is also important. Considering the reading level of the text that you put on your website is important. The different diagrams and imagery, providing them, for one, is important because some folks might learn better from a visual reference versus text. And then, like I mentioned earlier, that reduced animation motion. That is something that is supported on most devices and is important to make sure that your website complies with, because it's not something that happens out of the box. You usually have to manually add that through CSS. And the last category I'm going to mention is hearing impairments. So things that are important here are things like captions or providing sign language interpretations. Transcripts as well are very critical. All right, so that all sounds great, but how do we actually do it? This is something that personally I struggled with and spent a lot of time reading and researching to put something together that's sort of a checklist of sorts to make sure that when I review a PR or see somebody or write my own code, that I'm doing it in a way that is accessible. So here are some ways to do it. The first and most important thing is to make sure that there's an internal and external policy on accessibility for your company. This is a North Star to guide your organization towards what your goals are for accessibility. Usually it's just make the most accessible website you can, but what does that actually mean? Having it in a policy is very helpful. If you are in the fortunate role of getting to redesign a lot of a website, fun, exciting, love greenfield project work. Making sure that you involve accessibility very early in the design process will save you a lot of time and money versus having to retrofit it later on. But you can retrofit it later on if you need to. There's ongoing work. Make sure that you are prioritizing accessibility issues just like you would for different bug fixes or updates of your website. There are some tools that you can use that will help an existing website as well, like adding linting for accessibility or accessibility in tests. Might not be it's not necessarily going to catch everything, but it's better than nothing. Another thing, using design systems. If you use a design system that is accessible, as a caveat, then you don't have to worry about things like adding a label onto every single form component because your design system can enforce it. That's why design systems are really cool, especially if you're building a lot of content. Now everything's built in and you can make sure that there's a label on every single form component. It's great. Designing for all devices. This is another one that can be a little bit painful to try and do later on, but it's important to do. Then also, I'm including a link here, and the slides, I think I forgot to mention at the beginning, the slides are available in a Git repo. I will show the link again at the end. It's Brittany Ehrlich, github.com/Brittany Ehrlich/web-accessibility. But you can access the links there, and I'll paste it in the chat as well. But this link to the Accessibility Champions blog post is how we do it at GitHub. And I'm part of the Accessibility Champions program as an accessibility champion, and it's very cool. It's a good way to do it if you're looking at how large companies are doing accessibility now. The one most guiding principle that I can give software engineers about it is to use semantic HTML. That basically just means to use HTML in the way that it is meant to be written. So you can see two examples on this screen. One of them is an example of how to write HTML if you use semantic HTML to create a button, or how to turn a div into a button. You can see the first option just has button. You can put the on-click handler right in there. Click me, great. The second example is going to take a lot longer to develop and is a lot easier to get wrong. So you see you have to do things like adding a role, adding some ARIA components to it. The tab index, that's important to make sure that that div actually shows up when you're navigating with a keyboard. You might have to add some additional styling to make it actually look like a button if it's a div. Then you also have to think about all of the different ways that somebody can access a button. So some of those things are built in, like using the space bar or the enter bar. But if you are using a div and trying to style it into a button, you have to do that yourself. So there's a lot of different things that you have to think about that can just be very time-saving to use the actual HTML element the way that it is meant to be used. We'll go through some examples. Like I mentioned, we will have this. You'll be able to access all of these, and you're welcome to use and reuse all of these examples if you'd like to read through them. Some additional examples here. So some more examples of semantic HTML that are important for accessibility and other reasons. Having that doc type helps to communicate to not only the browser that you're using, but also screen readers, what is being conveyed to them. Again, the HTML tag with a language set, if it's an English website, it should have a language set for it. Things like the meta char set, like UTF-8, which characters are going to be represented on the website, or the title. There should be one page title that is unique to all of the other pages and descriptive of what is on the page, because that's important for screen readers. Some other examples. Landmarks. This is another section of semantic HTML. So headers, nav, main, footer, and aside are the main landmarks. These are not only useful for dividing up your website, but they're useful for screen readers that expect different content in each of these areas. Making sure that there's always a main landmark and that things like the navigation is inside of a nav landmark goes a long way towards making your website more accessible. Here's another overview, navigation. This is extremely boring to listen to, and it's usually at the top of every page. So thinking about letting screen reader or keyboard users skip it instead of having to go through each individual link every time is a good way to make your website more accessible to pretty much anybody who's using it by navigating through a keyboard. Headings, this was a very big one that I got wrong, particularly earlier in my career. I used to use headings a lot just to style different tags in HTML. And turns out they actually have meaning. So for example, there's an H1 through H6. There should always only be one H1 on the page, and it should usually match the page's title. They need to descend in order, so you can't necessarily just do H1 and then an H4. It needs to go H1, H2, H3, back up and down, depending, because these are important for navigating a website with a keyboard or a screen reader. It's one of the ways that a screen reader user can skim across the page. So making sure that your website is positioned in a way with its headings that it's easy to jump around to the relevant information is very important. And yes, do not use specific heading levels for styling. That's what CSS is for. I've learned that lesson the hard way. Semantic HTML buttons and links. This is another one that is really easy and very common to get wrong. So a button is for a particular action on a page, while a link is for a navigation or a change of context. You will almost certainly at some point in your career have a designer that wants a button that looks like a link or wants a link that looks like a button. And while you can design for that and follow that convention that the designer wants, it's usually better to try and suggest, hey, why don't we use the more accessible thing and make sure that this button is actually a button or the link is actually a link. If you lose that battle, you can still style something to look like that, but then you still use the same underlying HTML for the button or the anchor tag, so that if somebody does not have the ability to look at your website with a bunch of CSS, they'll still know what that particular action does. Some additional things about links. They should have enough text to understand what the link is for, what it's going to do, and where it's going to take you to. The accessibility properties in your Google Chrome DevTools will show the calculated name for each link, because it might not necessarily be just the one that you see. And it's a good way to see if there's enough information about that link for somebody to know what it does. The navigation links for your nav should always be in the same order on every page and be predictable. And then any link without any text associated with it should always have an accessible name. It's also useful for search engine optimization, so it's not necessarily just for accessibility here. But that means that if you have a link that is an icon, that's great, but you should probably also have some sort of a description that says what that link actually does. Images. This is another one that I think, particularly with a lot of web frameworks right now, I think they're pretty good about making sure that folks know that alt text is needed, which is great, but there's also a lot of ways to do it incorrectly. So the first thing that I can recommend is to avoid using text in images. Use an alt tag if you need it to explain exactly what the text says. Also using that alt attribute, it should be descriptive, but you don't necessarily need to do things like say an image of, because it's pretty obvious to somebody who's using a screen reader that it's an image because it'll have an image tag. You want to be descriptive, but not too descriptive. It shouldn't be a full novel in the alt text. Don't duplicate. If there's a caption in alt text, you don't need both of them necessarily. If there's enough information that a user can figure out what the image is for without having alt text, then you don't necessarily need it. It's another great thing to use the Chrome DevTools or browser of choice DevTools to handle that. And one recommendation that I've heard from screen reader users is that if an image is there just for vibes, describe the vibes. If it's there to just be like a cozy fireplace image to make the article that you're writing feel more cozy, describe that. And make sure that folks that are not able to see the image can still get those same vibes. Another one, graphs and diagrams should be not necessarily just a readout of the content on them, because that can be really hard, especially if it's a graph with a lot of data points, but a description of what the content is trying to say. So instead of saying X, Y coordinates 2, 3, say, this is a graph of showing that sales is getting better. It's 15% better this quarter than it was last quarter. That's much easier for folks to get. Another example, lists. Using ordered lists and unordered lists where there's appropriate. If there's a group of 3 items, it should be a list. And if it's an ordered group of 3 items, it should be an ordered list. Sounds pretty straightforward. Tables, this is another one where there's a lot of things that can go wrong. They're only used for tabular data, so something that is in a table. They should be including things like heading tags and scopes so that a screen reader can properly read the different things in it. And they should have a summary as well of the description of the data that's within. And you can see that my example actually does not include a summary, and it should. So I will update that. Forms, another lots and lots of pitfalls and things that even after 8 years in the industry, I still get wrong a lot. They're very easy to get wrong. You should be using different types of inputs. That not only helps when you have an input. For example, if you use something like email, it will give you some things by default, like making sure that the @ key is easy to get to with the keyboard if somebody is on a mobile device. Or password will make sure that the text doesn't show up by default. So the type on the input is very helpful. All fields also have to have a label. You will also, I think this is another thing that I run into a lot when I'm working with a designer who doesn't want to include the label because they want to just use the placeholder text, which sounds great, but you got to make sure that there's some sort of a label on there, even if it's hidden, so that a screen reader can properly read what the form is trying to ask for. You should always communicate which elements are required and use disabled tags on any input that is disabled. And trying to be as explicit as possible about errors. This is another one, another great example of something that benefits everybody and not just folks with disabilities. I get very frustrated when I run into password fields, for example, that tell you that your password is not secure enough, but then do not tell you what needs to change about it to make a password. So making sure that you're explicit as possible about errors is very helpful. Text, this is the last one, I promise. Sorry, it's a lot of stuff to get through, but this is the last one. Text. Using responsive elements like rems for text allows for better changes in text size when somebody zooms in and out. Making sure that text copy is understandable and thinking about the reading level of it. One website I really like is the HemingwayApp.com. This will tell you what the reading level is of text. I think pretty much every generative AI option can now do this as well. So lots of options out there. Avoiding technical jargon and acronyms. That's something that gets harder and harder to do the longer you're in the industry. But it's something that I always try to make sure that I am aware of when I'm writing a blog post or communicating something about, some sort of technical aspect of something, is making sure that you are explaining words that not everybody in the industry might know. There's a lot of frameworks and libraries out there that, like, the very first paragraph of them talk about how like unopinionated and verbose the language is, and like that means nothing to me. It's really, really hard to understand, and I usually get lost right there, right in the getting started part, because folks use those types of terms to describe what the language is, and they're a little gatekeepy and makes it really hard to keep up with, some technologies. Some do it better than others. Whew. All right. We made it through that. Hopefully that's a decent reference when you're actually going back and looking at those particular elements. But now I want to talk about accessibility testing. So this is something that folks might need to do quite a bit of an existing website, or something that they are when they're reviewing pull requests or something like that of somebody else's code. So the first thing, automated testing, is a great first step. And if you're doing nothing else, then that's a great place to start. But it typically only catches around 30% of accessibility bugs. There's things like HTML validation that will look at the HTML tree that is created for your website and make sure that it's just accurate. There's also some other tools that are dev tools or Chrome extensions, like the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool by WebAIM or Axe by Deque. There's also some JavaScript testing libraries and linters. So the HTML validation is great for checking low-hanging fruit. This is one that I use regularly, and it's a great place to start if you're doing nothing else. Then, like I mentioned, there's this Chrome extension. This one is particularly good if you're looking for color contrast checking. I think that that's pretty well built into Chrome DevTools now, but it's still worth looking at if you're trying to check the color contrast between different elements on a page. Axe by Deque. This is another one that I will hopefully show you here in a bit. It's a Chrome extension, adds the Axe tab to your DevTools, so it's really easy to get. And there's also JavaScript testing and linters that you can get. So you can have a linter that will automatically check for accessibility before you commit your code, which is awesome. This Axe Core test JavaScript testing library also lets you write tests with Axe, which is kind of cool because then you can write a test about your elements and make sure that as they change in the future, people continue to consider accessibility when they're changing that element. But the real meat of testing is manual testing. And this is the most important thing to do because this is what's really going to find the biggest accessibility issues within your application. So there's screen reader testing, a keyboard, a mouse or touchpad, the timing, visual elements, media, and then overall semantics. So a screen reader, pretty much every operating system will have one by default. I typically use macOS and iOS, so using VoiceOver for that. But then Windows has NVDA by default, and Android has one built in as well, TalkBack. These will read all text visible on the page and read some tags that a sighted user might not see, like an ARIA tag. Also lists all of the different headers and links on a website. This link right here to the Deque screen reader shortcuts is a really great place to start. I think that using a screen reader can be a little bit intimidating the first time you use it, so seeing some shortcuts is really handy. And I recommend that anybody who's doing anything on the front end get very comfortable with using a screen reader. Things that you want to test, making sure that all of the information on the page is read, all of the visual elements are read, that if there's a state or content change, like for example, if something is in progress and it changes to complete, that should be read out as well. Making sure that everything on the page can be navigated to and making sure that your page has an overall logical flow from top to bottom when you're looking at it from a screen reader. Manual testing, this is the original tab key before vibe coding existed. Making sure that you can navigate your website with a tab key is very critical. So make sure that you can navigate to each feature, particularly things like buttons or links or anything like that. Making sure you know where the focus is at any given point when you're navigating with a keyboard. That's very important to see where the focus is. And I can show you an example of what that looks like. But if you ever lose it, there's this little hack here where you can use the JavaScript console document.activeElement that will show you where the current focus is, which is really helpful. Making sure you don't get trapped anywhere. So if you enter a radio button or checkbox, you should also be able to get out of it if you're only navigating with a keyboard. And making sure that all of the different keyboard interactions, like for things like radio buttons and checkboxes, make sense. Because there's a lot of things where once you press the tab key to get into it, you're supposed to actually use the arrow keys to navigate around once you're there. So making sure that things just generally make sense for the normal ways that folks use a keyboard for navigation. Manual testing with a mouse. So things like making sure that when you click on something, the action should be when you release the click and not on the actual down event. That's because if you click and hold down and then navigate off of that link or button, then it should abort whatever it is that you were going to start doing. That's a thing that you need to make sure that all of those things do because they might not do them by default. If there's a timing element to your website, like for example, if it times out after a certain amount of time, users should have plenty of time to do whatever it is that they are trying to do. If there's a time limit, people should be able to turn it off or adjust it or extend it. That is one thing that can sort of run up against some of the things that you might need to weigh between security and accessibility. And that's just one of many, many things you might have to think of between as a software engineer. Visual elements, things to test, making sure that color contrast is acceptable, that color alone is not used to convey any information, that your feature is still usable if somebody zooms in, that you're testing on multiple screen sizes and not just desktop and not just mobile, and if something is visible on both portrait and landscape mode if you're looking on a mobile device. Media, We already talked about alt text, making sure that images that need it have alt text, that there are transcripts for video and audio, that videos have things like captions. And this is another example of something that is better for everyone and not just folks with disabilities, but making sure that your video and audio do not just automatically start playing when you navigate to a website. That can be very frustrating for everyone. Please don't do that. All right. Whew. So that is a lot of information. I apologize. But now we can actually walk through an example of testing a website for accessibility. So I think I'll put this in the chat if you want to follow along, but we're going to go find a website to test. And originally when I was putting this presentation together, I thought that I would just go and create the most inaccessible version of a website to see, to show off all of the different ways that something can go wrong. And it turns out I didn't have to go create one because I had already previously created one. So I'm using an app that I made when I first started learning how to code. I am a career switcher, and I switched into this career around 7 or 8 years ago. And so I had to go learn how to build things. And so this is one of the very first things that I built. It's called the RGB color game. I think it came from Colt Steele, I believe. I don't know if he's still making content, but when I was first learning React, I took one of his courses to learn React, and we made this color game where you get an RGB value, and you have to guess what color it is. And so I'll actually go through the demo in the images further on, but you can still go access the website if you want at my project's website. To play it, because it's pretty cool, and it's still just as inaccessible as it was just for a teaching tool. So the first thing we can do is take that entire link and check it on that HTML validator that I mentioned, and you'll see that there's a few things that come back. So we end up with some trailing slash warnings, but that's about it. Nothing terrible. So it didn't really catch much, but it caught a few things that I needed to change. Then running it through Axe DevTools. This is that DevTools Chrome extension that I mentioned. And it found on a completed game here, the background turns into the color that was chosen. And it found that there are some contrast issues between the text and the background, which makes sense. Also making sure that links have discernible text was also called out in this. There are a total of 5 issues, must meet the minimum color requirements, and links must have discernible text. It's like that's not super easy to see the entirety of it. But yeah, so it called out a few things too, but not everything. Using a screen reader, VoiceOver had no idea what was going on this site. Yeah, it's that's because you actually can't navigate to any of the game elements at all. All of these are, I can actually show here. Let me come out of full screen here. Exit and show the site. That's because all of these elements are just divs, which is very common. I think, I can take a div and turn it into anything. So all of these are just divs, which means that they aren't buttons, and you can't actually navigate to them with your tabbing through on a keyboard, which is a bummer because it's completely unusable. Yes, the mouse and touch testing seems good. The action is on release instead of on the down click, so that was nice that actually worked. And the action cancels when you navigate off of it. No timing elements to speak of, so continuing through the checklist, that one's okay. The visual elements, color contrast is acceptable. Not quite. When you actually finish a game, that's not going to work. I can show an example here. Super hard to read. And color alone isn't used to convey information. That's a tricky one because this is a game about color. So all of these are just color, and they're all the color is used just to convey information. So also not a super accessible thing. Let's see here. We can check different screen sizes. Here's a way to test. If I go down to this screen size, looks like it works. Still works when I change that. So that's not too bad. Visible in portrait and landscape mode. That's another one you can test using DevTools. So it is visible in landscape mode in addition to portrait mode. So that's good. All right. And finally, in our checklist, semantic HTML check. So checking things to make sure that there's a doc type, HTML tag, language, char set title, navigation with skip links, if the navigation is really long, that headings are used correctly, buttons are used correctly, et cetera, et cetera. We can do that just by checking this here. So you can see we have a doc type, we've got a language, the char set, the title is there, but it's actually not descriptive, so that's not great. You can go through and see this is just divs on divs on divs. This is not super helpful. We can take a look and see that this is also a div. The text is a div, so there's no actual headings on this. At least these are actual buttons, so that's nice. So yeah, there's some work that needs to be done. So we can identify all of the issues on this by going through that checklist and see, all right, we had those trailing slash warnings. We need to remove or fix the search icon. There's a search icon on this page that only has a search icon, a magnifying glass, and not actually any text, which was caught by the Axe DevTools. Creating a skip link for the navigation. There is no skip link for the navigation. So every single time you tab through this page, you have to go through every single bit of navigation. Adding an H1 to actually match the title. There is no H1 at all, and the title is not super descriptive. We kind of need to explain what RGB is and what the goal of the game is to users because it's not very clear. We need to fix the color contrast on the page title, and then make colors keyboard navigable and selectable by a screen reader. And then finally, add an alternate tag for what the color may be called for low vision users, because right now, a low vision user has no idea what any of these actually mean. So I'm just going to go through a couple of those and how I would personally fix it, given this information. So one thing that we could do is add an actual H1 to match the title. So instead of going from these divs, we could say, hey, this is an H1, the title, the great RGB color game, and the RGB values below can be an H2. Makes it much more navigable. We can also go through and add some explanation on what the actual game is. Things like RGB is a color model used to create a vast variety of colors by combining red, green, and blue. The goal of the game is to take the RGB value below and guess which of the color block options corresponds to the value. Learn more about RGB values here. Note that we have quite a bit of text in here so that folks know exactly where that link is going to take them. And, whoop. All right, and fixing the color contrast. So we can move the style tag for the color gameplay area div and make sure that the color only goes around the play area and not the actual H1. To make the color blocks navigable by a keyboard, we can just turn those divs into actual buttons and add styling to the buttons so that it represents those colors. Adding a name for each color, that's a little bit trickier, but is possible. So I went and found a color.js website that will actually take a hex value for a color and turn that into a name. So maybe not the best name in the world, but it's better than nothing. So all of these things are fairly simple changes to make it so that the entire app can be navigated from any user and not just users that are sighted and able to use keyboard navigation. And honestly, not super hard to do. Didn't take long to actually go through and use that checklist, as we can see. Obviously, I did that before this time when I made the slides, but it probably only takes 30 minutes to an hour to actually go and test a website, one that small, maybe 15 minutes to test it in all those different ways and see what can be cleaned up about it and then actually fix it. With that, I hope that I have convinced you, at least a little bit, that accessibility should be one of your key skill set investments as you are learning and getting into this industry. If not, let me know, and we can keep talking about it. I'm happy to do so. And 2, I hope that I gave you some of the tools to make the web a more accessible place. Hopefully you're convinced, or at least hopefully you learned something new. This is the list of resources that I mentioned. Again, my website is BrittanyEllick.com. Let's be friends on the internet. I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. That is it.
Alrighty. So that was fantastic actually. Although we were going to open now the Q&A. So if you guys have questions, feel free to drop your questions on the chat and we will have it answered. So I actually do have one while we wait for the others with their questions. So this is just plainly out of my curiosity. So what sparked your interest in deep diving into web accessibility?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's something that I really struggled to learn about for a long time. I did a lot of front end work and knew that I needed to learn about accessibility because it's something that was on every single job application related to accessibility or related to front end work. So I knew that it was something that was going to make me a little bit more competitive in the job market if I knew quite a bit about it. And just an interest in learning it and teaching it to other folks because it's really surprisingly difficult to find information on it, actually. There's a lot of like legalese speak about like this thing needs to have this type of element, blah, 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 but not as much content related to how to actually do it. So I found an opportunity to teach other folks on my team about it as well.
Actually, that is really good because I am not really, I won't say much, but I don't think this is a well talked in the tech industry. So yeah, actually we do have a question though. What kind of accessibility related questions should I be ready for interviews if this occurs?
That's a good question. I think one of the biggest ones that I will ask somebody if I am interviewing them and want to see if they know anything about accessibility is about ARIA. And that's because the number one rule about ARIA from folks that know how to use accessibility is that you should not use it. Ideally, you should be using semantic HTML instead of ARIA. But if somebody says, like, oh, I want to make sure that this has this ARIA label in this role and blah, 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 like that's clearly something that they are not aware of what accessibility is. So something like that. Also, being aware of why accessibility is important. Those legal reasons tend to be, you don't need to know the actual reasons, but knowing that there are some legal implications is usually useful for your employer. But also just saying, you want your website to be usable by everybody. That's a pretty good reason too.
All right. Hopefully that answers Desiree's question. I'm going to skip Q1 because I think Brett might be asking for the question. He asked, is the presentation on your GitHub repo?
Yes, it is. I used SlideDev, so the presentation is in Markdown on my GitHub repo. If you go to the repo and look under slides, and then there should be a folder for Tech Academy that has the slides there. Slides.markdown is where you'd want to look.
All right. Next question that we do have is from Jorley. Is speech to text related to web accessibility?
You tried adding a speech to text feature. I haven't personally worked with speech to text, but I have a feeling this is one of those things that began as an accessibility feature that then a lot of folks realized that they really liked because there's a lot of those out there. So yeah, I would say that speech to text is most likely related to accessibility because it allows somebody who, maybe is not able to use a keyboard to make sure that their text is written on the keyboard. Does the feature slow down the website? I don't know if that's related specifically to speech to text or accessibility in general, but I don't think that most accessibility things would slow down a website. One of the things you also want to make sure you're doing is making sure that you're making, small and compact websites so that it can be downloaded from any bandwidth or internet speed. So that's the ability to access a website quickly is also an accessibility concern.
Mhm. Got it. So another question from Audrey. Um, you mentioned about vibe coding. Do you think that vibe coding would later also include web accessibility for sites that are vibe coded?
Yes, I think that all of us are going to be employed for a very long time fixing vibe coded websites in the future. Yeah, there's a lot of things that LLMs might put together that I'm a heavy AI user, so it's not that I'm saying don't use them, but they do not always produce the most accessible code. And so having a human actually look at the code and test it out and make sure that it actually works the way that you would expect is very important. And yeah, I think that there's definitely going to be a long career ahead of us for fixing web accessibility as well as other bugs associated with vibe coded websites.
All right. So I actually do have one question. I'm not
Mhm.
sure if it's somewhat could be related, but is AI currently helping or hurting or probably disrupting web accessibility efforts of developers?
Um, I don't think it's probably hurting it in any way because of the fact that 96% of websites have accessibility issues. So we're starting from a pretty low bar to begin with. And I think that anybody who's aware of accessibility is probably considering that when they're using AI, and anybody who isn't probably wouldn't be considering that anyway when they're using AI tools. So that's just my opinion. I don't know that that's actually the case or not, but yeah, it's that's a good question.
Because AI has been really active lately. This I think this generation is mostly on AI now. So we were kind of curious about if it's going to hurt what we do on personally on our websites. That's all.
It could be. I think that you can probably also ask your AI tool of choice to make sure, you can probably ask like, hey, is this going to be accessible to most users? And it's probably just as good, if not better, than most of those other automated tools that I mentioned. But I think there's still nothing that really beats like testing it yourself with a screen reader or navigating with the keyboard to see what's actually there. Because again, the computer can only see what the computer can see, not necessarily what a human can see.
All right. I think I have another one.
Yeah.
Well, actually, this is from my team, to be honest. But the question is, do you ever get pushback when suggesting accessibility improvements at work, and how do you handle that?
That's a good question because I still very frequently, every time I'm working on something, say, hey, this might not be the best thing to do for accessibility reasons. At my current company at GitHub, we care very deeply about accessibility, and that's almost always like our first thing that we're like, hey, if this is not going to be accessible, then we're not going to do it. But I've definitely seen that in the past when it comes to like the button link thing or the link as a button thing, where I've talked to a designer and said, hey, like this is technically a button. It should be a button and not look like a link. And yeah, I've gotten pushback there, but at some point you have to weigh the trade-off, like with everything else related to software engineering. Luckily, you're the one writing the code, so you can always override the decision there.
All right. Thank you for that. Is there any questions left for Brittany for today before everything else? Any other things you want to say to our attendees today, Brittany?
I don't know. Just feel free to reach out if you want to chat ever. I am on the internet a lot, and happy to answer any questions. Like I said, I was a career switcher. I would imagine being a boot camp, that's probably a common path for a lot of folks that are in this group. So happy to chat through that if you're ever curious. And I'm so glad to see folks entering software engineering. I think it's a really great field. I know there's a lot of fear mongering out there about it, but pretty much all that fear mongering is not real. So it's a good field to be in for sure.
I have to agree on that one.
Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, well, I guess that was it was a fantastic talk with you, Brittany. I had so much fun with this talk. and we'd love to have you or to have you again as our guest in our future references. Thank you so much. And before we wrap up today's event, keep an eye out on our next schedule. For next week, we'll be doing a Tech Talk replay along with more exciting sessions coming up on our way and your way. So, again, thanks everyone. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend ahead of you. And Brittany, again, thank you so much for doing this Tech Talk with us. And yeah, we'll
Cool.
see you guys around. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you. Bye, guys.